It's now 1 p.m. Geneva time. We are officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is with us at the International Environment House here in Geneva. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the video of this event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for an event organized by the Geneva Science-Policy Interface in collaboration with the Geneva Environment Network. The event will discuss the strengths and limits of global intergovernmental science policy interfaces. This session is included in the program of the University of Geneva Summer School on Science Policy Interfaces for Environmental Solutions, Learning to Span Boundaries. As the Secretary General of the United Nations keeps repeating, we are facing a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, complex and intertwined, calling for action. In International Geneva, home of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we know that active engagement between scientists and policy actors towards science-informed solutions is essential. The outcomes of the IPCC and IPBES assessments do feed the major negotiations taking place in the numerous institutions convening here and in many other places around the world. Today's event will discuss the strengths and limits of existing global intergovernmental science policy interfaces and explore the stakes and challenges linked to this type of boundary organization, notably for the creation of new interfaces such as the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution Prevention that is now being negotiated, following up a resolution that was adopted last year at the United Nations Environment Assembly. Milja RANN, sitting here on my right, Science Policy Officer at the Science Policy Interface, will moderate today's session. Before I hand over to Miali, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link is being shared in the chat for who is online or is on the screen. Throughout the event, those of you who are online can raise their questions by using the Q&A box. So we have a dedicated session to answer these after the presentations. And finally, let me also add for those who are online that the transcription is available at the bottom left of your screen. You have a look at the current slide, which shows where to access automated transcript in 100 languages. With that, Miali, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana. My name is Miali RANN. I'm from the Geneva Science-Policy Interface, which is an initiative of the University of Geneva, created 5 years ago with the support of the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs. Our mandate is to support collaboration between scientists, but also policymakers to have, as Diana said, science-informed policy. And this summer school is part of one of our streams of activity, which is capacity building and training activities, but we also have a calls of project and also produce some insights on science policy dynamic. So for us, this summer school, we have 15 participants here for the summer school that we're really privileged to have. And obviously we had this session because global science policy panel are key to the interface of science and policy interface. And we thought it was a very good idea for them to understand more what those global panel is, because also in the environmental field, it is flourishing. You have IPCC, IPBES, and new panel that are coming up under negotiation that Martin will talk about. But there are also other ideas of having new panels. There are discussions to have maybe a One Health panel. There are discussions to have an ocean sustainability panel. So I think at this stage, it's also important to understand what have we gained from this panel so far. That's why we've decided to have this event. And today we are really privileged to have a free speaker that can explore the functioning and the impact of this panel, including what works and what works a bit less. They are what we call in our field boundary spanners. So the scientists that are actively engaged at the interface between science and policy for several years. The short introduction that I will give now about them doesn't do any justice to the wealth of experience that they have in the field. So we have Professor Silke BECK. Professor Silke BECK is she is from the Technical University of Munich. She's a professor of Sociology of Science, while being an author on the ongoing IPBES assessment on transformative change. She has also analyzed the role and design of both the IPCC and IPBES. We also have Professor Martin SCHERINGER, who is a professor of environmental chemistry at Masaryk University and a senior scientist at ETH Zurich. He is also the chair of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. He's the chair of the board of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. It's an international network of researchers that aim to bridge the gap between science, policy, and the public regarding major issues of chemical pollution. And then we have also very privileged today joining us online. We have Professor Diana ÜRGE-VORSATZ. Diana is a professor at the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy at the Central European University. She has also had a long involvement with IPCC. She's been a coordinating lead author of 2 assessments report, and she's currently the vice chair of IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation and climate change adaptation. So let's start directly our discussion. And for us, especially for our participants for the summer school, what I thought was interesting to start with is really to understand what those panels are doing, and also how they work, and also what are their strengths, what have they achieved so far. So our speakers will have one presentation each on those. So we will start first with Diana, and then Silke, and then Martin will talk about the new panel on chemical and pollution. So Diana, I give you the floor. You're muted.
I'm sorry. I apologize that I can't be with you in person. I had a small family emergency, but I'm really happy to present online. So today what I want to talk about is what are the secrets of the IPCC model that now a lot of the other platforms are copying, but of course with a lot of new adaptations. So yes, it's working. So as you see, the IPCC was formed about 30 years ago. So we have a long history of the IPCC, and it already has been informing and shaping global climate change related policy, but also on a regional level. So initially, it was formed because science related to climate change was extremely controversial. One scientist said there is really emergency, another said no, there is actually no climate change. The third that there is climate change, but it's not man-made, and so on. So it was important to have a body which can pull the science together and which governments can equally trust, and produce a document that can serve as a basis of the global negotiations. And you see that it has been already influencing many of the climate change related processes, the different reports. Also shortly, it's important to understand that initially it was mostly a meteorology related organization, but as time passes and as we are producing more and more of our assessment reports, we are currently basically covering the entire breadth of science. Almost no field of science and humanities is now absent from IPCC. So yes, IPCC has already made significant impact after the first assessment report, because the IPCC works mainly by producing so-called assessment reports. That means roughly about every 6 to 7, now due to the pandemic it was 8 years, we produce the assessment report which synthesizes and assesses all the recent science related to climate change, presently in 3 working groups, plus there are 2 other kind of working groups working on inventories and climate change related data. So these are the 5 assessment reports, because we just finished the 5th one. And for example, the first one led to the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second assessment report led to the Kyoto Protocol, or was a significant input for the Kyoto Protocol. The third assessment report also had many different types of results, but perhaps among them the most important is that we can't only focus on mitigation, but also need to focus on adaptation. After the fourth assessment report, we have global acceptance of the 2-degree centigrade limit, and also the IPCC was recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize, which I will say in a minute. And the fifth assessment report was, of course, input and a significant catalyst for the Paris Agreement. And we hope that also for the sixth assessment report will play an important role, among others, to the global stocktake. And yes, in 2007, the IPCC shared the Nobel Peace Prize with former Vice President Al Gore for its work on strengthening climate literacy around the world. So I think one of the tricks of the IPCC is how the reports are prepared, and we may not all be able to see this figure, but let me just walk you through the important parts. So first of all, every report starts with a so-called scoping meeting. It's important to understand that the authors for the scoping meeting are often not the same as those who will actually write the report. So there is some level of new blood and new perspectives already, refreshment perspectives there as well. In the scoping meeting, also we have a few policymakers, because really the most important, and I will say in a minute, that one of the secrets, I think, of the success of the IPCC model is the knowledge co-generation. And it starts at the scoping meeting where, although it's mostly scientists, but also a few policymakers who help ask the questions. What is the outline really answering the questions that policymakers want answers to? And then comes the approval of the outline, and that is together with the governments. So governments and the authors jointly form an outline. And that is a really important stage in the co-generation process, because that means that already first the policymakers are already engaged, they are involved in the production of the report. So it will not just be one other report that sits on the shelf, but also they help really answer or make sure that the questions that are asked are those that they are really interested in answering. Nevertheless, at that point, the policymakers get out of the picture, and all the rest, all the way until the final approval, is only among the scientists, except in the review process, they also provide inputs, but they are not influencing the report, the content of the report. The authors own the report all the way until the approval. So there are 3 gradual review processes, and that's really important that that in the end, the entire scientific community is invited to review the reports, which means that I also get a lot of colleagues in Hungary say, no, my science is not in there. I dispute that. This is not true because I actually proved that blah, blah, blah. Okay, no problem. Please provide your publications and your review comments and your publications that prove your science and your research. And it's and the authors will have to take that into account and transparently display it on the website how they took that into account. So basically, no science is excluded. It's a really inclusive process, and by the author selection, it's also very diverse. So yes, everything does get approved together with the government, and that is really important line by line. So it's another very important part of the co-generation process, whereas we do receive a lot of criticism that, yes, it dilutes the meaning. But actually, after my 20-some years of experience with IPCC, I actually really say that that it actually benefits the reports and the SPM. And it's important to understand that only SPM, only the summary for policymakers gets approved line by line by the governments, not the content. And also the governments can only argue with their science. So they cannot say, I don't like this, but they have to argue, no, actually the science says that perhaps the emphasis should be on this rather than that. And the reason why I say my statement is that it actually strengthens the reports is the following. Right now, we are still unable to mobilize sufficient voices, sufficient scientists from either the Global South or other different perspectives, which are also very important to climate change, but it's still very much the global north dominating from the perspective that still the publications are also in general much more from the global north than the global south. So in this stage, actually this gets very well corrected. So the governments do help this bias, which is not deliberate, but this unconscious bias to be fixed a little bit. But this is mostly my opinion and not an official IPCC opinion. So here is the summary of the points why I believe that the IPCC model has become so successful in influencing policy differently than just scientists writing reports for policymakers. So first, as I already mentioned, the knowledge co-generation, but it's important again that it's grounded in science, and also because it has an independent phase, it is uninfluenced in the expert phase. So it's, in the end, the report itself is not cannot be changed due to political interest, and it's only the summary which is then shaped by a balance of different perspectives. And we will talk a lot more about this, I think, so I don't want to get into details. The policy relevance, but not policy prescriptiveness, is a really important strength, I believe, that nobody can, that it's, you know, from this point, this is what the science says, and from this point, policymakers, it's your choice. But we tell you, if you choose this one, this is going to be the consequence. If you choose that one, that will be the consequence. From this, it's your choice. It's also really important that it's based on voluntary contributions. So nobody in the IPCC is actually paid for this work. And still there is a really important, really major competition for this. Also, the balance of authors, which I mentioned, and the inclusiveness is a really important asset. Also, the review rounds, which I already mentioned, and strict policies on both funding and communication. I believe that these are also really strong points on first the credibility of anything that the IPCC says. So this is why I always add also here, this is not what the IPCC says, this is my view. Otherwise, most what I'm presenting is based on IPCC materials. But also that the IPCC cannot accept any funding from anywhere except from governments. So that also really helps us staying and the voluntary nature of our authors, because this has become a very politicized field with major attempts to influence. So that really protects the integrity of the science and the credibility and trustworthiness of the science that is put out by the IPCC. So I think that's hopefully enough for introduction, and we'll get into the details later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was really interesting. I really liked that slide about the secret of IPCC, which we're all interested in. So let's continue the conversation with Professor Silke BECK, who is going to tell us if the IPBES is the IPCC of biodiversity. You know, here we go.
Thank you very much. Where are the slides? Okay, can we get the pictures? It's on the screen. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to this wonderful panel, and thank you, Diana, for introducing into the IPCC, and it makes it easier for me because I can point to the similarities but also differences between the IPCC and IPBES. And my title is not just an IPCC for biodiversity, and I'm trying to summarize lessons that we can learn from IPBES. So what are the achievements and strengths of this science policy interface? So in 2004, there was some publication by famous biologists, ecologists in Nature, and they raised the question, why isn't there an international panel of experts for biodiversity? And so, because I did my PhD on the IPCC, I was asked, Silke, what can we learn from the IPCC to build up a new interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services? And so my question was, the IPCC is very successful. It's a template and it's a role model, but you can't easily reproduce the success story of the IPCC by applying the same model. There is no script, there are no standard practices to copy, and you have to ask carefully what are challenges, particular challenges arising in the field of biodiversity, and is the IPCC model, are the rules of procedures fit for function to address all these challenges, such as diversity of knowledges, diversity of stakeholders, knowledge holders, but also scales, and is an assessment as a function enough to catalyze decision-making on the ground. So, so my experience working over 20 years on science policy interface is there is no fixed template or role model, because science policy interfaces are dynamic organization. They have to deal with different diverging challenges. They have also to be responsive to changing political contexts, such as the UN Convention and so on. They change over time, and Diana can also confirm that the IPCC has changed remarkably over time. And they also will change in the future. So in other words, one of my points is that the way how science policy interfaces respond and are learning, meaning that they can readapt their institutional arrangement and procedure, this is very important for science policy interfaces to survive in such a politicized international context. Okay, what is important to design or create a new science policy interface and setting up IPBES? There have been many, many workshops, many conversations and negotiations. And the idea here was to build networks and get a strong alliance to support a new science policy interface. And it was also the idea to bring together not only ecologists, natural scientists, but also social scientists, and last but not least, stakeholders and people working for international negotiations for some years. And this was very helpful or instrumental to set up the agenda for a new science policy interface. And last but, I guess there was an emergent consensus that a new science policy interface has to move beyond assessments. This doesn't mean that the IPCC does a bad job or that there are deficits, but the point here was that the challenges, the tasks are different when it comes to biodiversity, and therefore a new emerging science policy interface has to broaden, first of all, its function, not only assessment, but also performing different functions. It has to address a broader range of actors, not only governments and scientists, but also stakeholders at all levels. And therefore, last but not least, in order to produce knowledge which is relevant on the ground, you have to address different scales and levels of decision making. And finally, in 2012, the IPBES was set up. I guess the mission is not far away from the IPCC. It's to provide a knowledge foundation or knowledge base for decision making. The IPBES is also an intergovernmental panel similar to the IPCC, meaning that governments are contributing and they have the decision-making power when it comes to the scope, but also to the institutional structure of the panel. The IPBES is much younger than the IPCC. It's in in its second work program. The first work program started in 2014 and was finalized in 2018. And the second work program is on its way. And Masaryk can tell you more later on if you are interested. And in comparison with the IPCC, IPBES has a collaborative partnership arrangement with much more international organizations such as the United Nations Environmental Program, but also the Food Agriculture Organization and so on. You see it on the institutional figure. And last but not least, it's also addressing not only the international community, but it's also trying to address many stakeholders, many organizations from the international to the local level. And last but not least, it's hosted at Germany, Bonn. The Secretariat is hosted at Germany, Bonn. So when it comes to IPBES, how is IPBES structured? As I mentioned, it's also an intergovernmental body, meaning that governments have decision-making power in the plenary, but IPBES also has many observers to the plenaries, not as states that are not member states, but also biodiversity-related conventions such as the CBD, other United Nations body. And this seems to me a major difference to the IPCC. There are much more and more diverse organizations and stakeholders accredited to IPBES, and there are also stakeholder days before the plenaries. In other words, even if they don't have decision-making power in the plenary, stakeholders play a much more influential role when it comes to IPBES than to the IPCC. What does IPBES do? So as I mentioned, it tried to move beyond assessments. Nevertheless, the IPBES has provided many assessments. I don't want to go into details. And in addition to assessments, IPBES has engaged with policy support. What does it mean? It does mean to identify policy-relevant tools and methodologies, and also trying to facilitate their use and catalyze their future development. Very important is also that the IPBES engage in building capacities. This was starting with the identification of priority capacity needs of different members, experts, and stakeholders. And last but not least, and this is also quite innovative, IPBES is trying to catalyze the generation of new knowledge and is trying to identify and communicate gaps in knowledge in order to help IPBES to fill these gaps. And I don't have the time to go into detail. In the first working program, IPBES produced 8 assessments, and as far as I can see, the global assessment in 2019 on the right side was the most influential assessment. And this comes to my final slide. What are the strengths of IPBES? I would say it was based on a well-functioning model of the IPCC, but it included a set of innovative approaches. So it developed an innovative conceptual framework, also bringing in other voices and other ways of seeing and valuing nature. It developed a new approach to recognize and work with indigenous and local knowledge. And this is really important because everybody talks about including stakeholder and indigenous knowledge, but it's very innovative and experimental how IPBES tries to fulfill this job. IPBES has a capacity building program, and as I mentioned, a method to address knowledge gaps. And IPBES did a great job to involve communities around the globe at large, over 160 governments as members, but more than thousands of scientists and other knowledge holders, and it was trying to review more than 35,000 scientific publications and more than 50,000 peer review comments. And this is a lot of hard work, as we as authors can tell you. And so in other words, I guess the way how IPBES includes diverse knowledges and also tries to build up capacity to deal with topics is quite special about IPBES. I'm sorry, as far as I know, there is no graph or no research what the impact of IPBES on policy making is, as Diana's graph. But it seems to me that the global assessment has received a lot of attention at the national level. For instance, in Germany, there was a ministry with conference with the ministry, and it got a lot of attention by media, and it also contributed to accelerate decision making on biodiversity loss and supporting ecosystem functions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silke. That was really interesting to see those specific features of IPBES. So to continue our discussion, we'll continue now with Professor Martin SCHERINGER. You have been involved in the discussion regarding the new panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution. So what does this new panel try to achieve, or what does it want to do? Tell us more a bit about that.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for putting up the slides, and welcome also from my side to everybody. And it's now my turn to speak about the new Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution Prevention. This is a panel that is not yet in existence, so we have not yet got of record and history that we can review. To explain to some extent the processes around this new panel and also my role in that, I first would like to introduce the IPCP, the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, which is a bit of a complication because I will tell you more about that in a minute. First, the IPCP, what it is a global network of academic scientists working on chemical pollution issues from all disciplines, but the requirement really is people have to be academics, and that's a must. Legally, it's an NGO, it's an association according to Swiss civil law. It was established in 2008. There is a website, ipcp.ch, where you find our bylaws and data and contributions and recordings of webinars we have organized. And also, importantly, the IPCP is, like many other NGOs, admitted as an observer for the Science Policy Panel Open-Ended Working Group. This is a technical term for a process that UNEP organizes to set up such a panel. It's a government-owned, government-run process where scientists and others are just observers, but can, of course, and should provide their input. Similar is the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee for the New Plastics Treaty. And also there, the IPCP is an observer, and is also an observer at the BRS conventions that Agustin presented yesterday. Why is this important? More than 15 years ago, I published this editorial calling for an intergovernmental panel on chemical pollution. There was nobody, as Silke said, that people would be asking, why is there no IPCC for chemicals? At that time, it was just me and some colleagues who asked that question, but nobody at the government level did ask that question. So we tried to create that momentum or that idea, but nobody really picked it up. So there was no momentum at all for an intergovernmental panel on chemicals at the time in 2006, 7, 8. And then what we had to do is to just have a minimum solution, and that's why we formed the IPCP as an international panel, of course not an intergovernmental panel, because that's what we can't do as individual scientists, just a small kind of club of individuals who would help the idea to survive. We wanted the idea of an intergovernmental panel to survive and wanted to keep the discussion going. And that's then what we did for 15 years or so. And then 5 years ago, for complicated reasons, the idea again gained new momentum, and also in the UN system at the UN level. And we were tasked then, the IPCP as an organization was then established. We were tasked by the Swiss government to provide an extensive mapping and gap analysis of existing science policy interface bodies in the area of chemicals and waste. That is a lengthy and a bit dry report, but it is a good map of what's there, and you can download it from Zenodo if you want to take a look. And then in 2021, we were able to publish a really important document. That's this paper in Science, where we outlined what such a panel could look like, what the tasks could be, the benefits, also the limitations, the downside perhaps. So all the pros and cons in a way, but in the end, we said we would call for such a panel. So to us, the positive aspects were more important than the potential downsides, such as more administration or costs and all that. And then we ran a sign-on campaign, and we received more than 2,000 signatures from scientists from all over the world, from more than 85 countries, to support that call for such a panel. And that was very good and important as momentum in the process at the UN level, because at then UNIA 5, the meeting was held in 2022, where the resolution was then passed that such a panel should be established. And I think that process here was also an element that led to that kind of decision in a way. So that's what we have done over the years as scientists, trying to call and to support the process for such a panel. Why is such a panel needed? Oh, sorry. That was too fast. Nowadays, we talk about the triple crisis that has been mentioned, but it was quite different until just a few years ago. Chemical problems, chemistry pollution problems were not recognized, not seen in many parts of UN policies and politics. And you look at how chemicals assessment technically works, you will see that it is what we could call underprotective in all jurisdictions in the world. We totally, I think, underestimate the impact of chemicals on human health and the environment under the current schemes of chemical assessment. Therefore, this has to improve, and we think that such a panel could also help in that respect. Then chemical pollution is still not yet sufficiently visible and present at the international level, or even also national level in environmental policy in many countries. That's a reality still. And of course, then, and that's the main point for such a panel, of course, science and policy need a structured way of interacting. And that's what we see here in this little graph, where first of all, we see academia or science on the left and policy on the right. And normally these two are disjunct and disconnected and different. They have a different logic, different language, different goals, different actors. There are different rules. And scientists basically are interested in generating results and publishing them in scientific journal papers at the bottom here underneath the blue box. And if a scientist wants to talk to a policy person, it's difficult because they don't know who to ask, where to find them, and how to establish the contact. The same also applies to the policymakers, because they may also have lots of scientific questions, but they don't know where to find the scientists that would be able to help them. And they may not be able to search all the journal papers. So that's the other arrow down there, because there are millions of journal papers published, and where to find the ones that may matter. So that's one thing, there is this mismatch. But then even worse, there are certain actors, and we have seen that, and we have also a lot of evidence for that, that use that void between the two sides to create misleading information and create doubt about the facts and the matter that is at stake and up for discussion. I can share more information about that if needed later on. And in one of the links we held as a webinar earlier this year, where we had different speakers talking about industry tactics to create doubt. One of the speakers was Rob Bilott, the lawyer who organized the case against DuPont in the US, who was portrayed in the movie Dark Waters. He was one of the speakers in our webinar, and all the talks have been recorded and are available. So then, of course, obviously, we should fill that void with a panel, with a body that creates structure and facilitates the exchange of the two sides, that organizes the information flow, that organizes communication, because scientists normally don't have that communication aspect as part of their work. And it also establishes contact points, people who are known as the contact people who are available, who would not disappear. It's not just pure luck if you find someone, but you know there is that institution and you can find that person and open a process that may even last over several years to learn and to establish this exchange. That's then what the panel would then offer. That's my last slide. I would just say a few words about successes, because that was also one of the questions. But for that, I would I can't talk about the panel yet. First of all, it has to be defined, it has to be set up, the operating principles have to be defined, and then the panel has to first build its reputation. And that's a long process that will take some years. I will just go back quickly to the BRS conventions that Agustin presented yesterday, because I have worked for many years in the context of the Stockholm Convention, and there is a body called the POPs Review Committee. It's a technical body under the convention, but it's also a science policy interface at the global level, because its members are the ones who have to decide or to prepare, not decide, to prepare a decision for the COP, whether or not a chemical is a persistent organic pollutant. And this is exactly then what we have to do as scientists, offer our knowledge as input to that process, and then this body discusses the science. And I was able at least 2 times to provide input on certain chemicals that then led in the end to first a decision of the POPs Review Committee that it says that this chemical is a persistent organic pollutant, and then also these 2 decisions of the POPs Review Committee were then confirmed confirmed by the COP, who then also decided that these chemicals should be listed as POPs. So there was a direct way of providing input to an important policy process that was targeted. Of course, it was more structured than such a broad panel. And there it was, in the end, also rewarding to be active in this way as a scientist. I would stop here and then continue with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was also very interesting to see what are the progress of this new panel that is being negotiated. So I think my next question now is also a very interesting one. And we thought we'd have this more as a discussion. What do you guys think? You've been involved, obviously, with these different types of interfaces for many years. How have been the limits and the challenges of this panel to actually achieve what it wants to do, which is to steer and for IPBES in particular, to steer policy making. And then we, as Diana presented, we have to address the triple planetary crisis, and how, as there are some limits that you've experienced through your years, and what you've seen also with governments or funding organizations that have tried to use the result of this panel. Have you found some limits of what this panel can do at the end of the day, because they're supposed to produce knowledge, but also to advance in some way policy making on this topic? So maybe for that, I will start with Diana, and then Silke, and then I'll ask Martin to present a bit what the challenges is you've experienced in IPCP for the work so far, so that could also contribute to this discussion that the new panel may find on its way. So Diana, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I want to address some of the perceived limitations and perceived challenges. And one of them I already addressed in my presentation, that clearly if you work in a large intergovernmental body based on consensus, then in the end you will really go mostly in the largest common denominators. So meaning that the extremes are not addressed. And in climate change, this is an issue, since there are we also need to prepare for the events which have a low likelihood but very high implications. I think now the IPCC is addressing these also very well by indicating exactly, very precisely, the likelihood of the events, and also the uncertainty related to the knowledge that we are presenting. So I think it's not a real limitation. And as I also mentioned, I think the process which results in this consensus actually does strengthen the product of just a scientist. So I think it's more a strength than a limit. Now, what I perceive as a limitation, and again, it's not an official IPCC position, is actually related to what Silke was presenting. And she mentioned that already IPCC changed a lot, and how also IPBES was structured differently for IPCC from the perspective of institutional change. Now, my experience is that actually institutional change in IPCC is very difficult, and there is a major institutional momentum. Fortunately, it may actually really also be the strength, because because as many of my colleagues often say, what is not broken, let's not fix it. So if it has been successful so far, and it's doing a very important job, then we clearly have, maybe it is better to keep it that way, because there are always many ideas to change different ways. Nevertheless, I think it's still, if not necessarily limitation, but it's definitely not easy to address issues. For example, there has been for many cycles discussions that it's not ideal that, for example, working group 2 and 3 work so separately, because we, in the end, also create the science in silos. It's just because we have adaptation addressed separately from mitigation, also, and because scientists produce their publications and scientists also mingle in IPCC or related to IPCC in the same community. And that's why that is one of the factors why there is not sufficient integration between adaptation and mitigation, and that perhaps the IPCC may address with institutional change, but it's very difficult. But I'm not saying that it would necessarily be better, because it was very interesting to see both Silke's and Martin's presentation, and how Silke addressed that IPBES's focus is much broader and more stakeholders involved and are the seat and so on. On the other hand, if you want to address everything and anything, that's also very difficult. So already we have reports that are, in the end, altogether tens of thousands of pages, and so it's already difficult to keep the focus. So there is always pluses and benefits of broadening the scope, but still, then it's very difficult to keep the focus. I see two further challenges. And one is, I also mentioned communication, that it's really the strength of IPCC, that not everybody who works in IPCC or is an author at IPCC can just say whatever they want, because clearly all of us have different perspectives, different scientific angles, different opinions. And when we speak wearing the IPCC hat, we can only really present what has been approved by the government and what went through the very strict and rigorous review process, and which is very important. But then we still would need much more communication. But today, communication is very challenging, because communication is no longer mainly about just what goes on in the main news, but it's a lot about a myriad of social media platforms and so on. And clearly you need a huge capacity for that, but also on social media, then all the legitimacy of an institution's communication, because you have to respond perhaps to comments, is questioned. So simply, I think it's a big challenge how, and not only for the IPCC, but in general, how in today's world where communication is extremely important, but it's fragmented by a myriad of different channels, how it can be still maintained, especially by a body where every word that you say can make a huge difference. Just imagine that in our approvals, we spend sometimes hours debating a few words, what single word we should use. And finally, I think what is a new challenge is that in this area of the three main problems, really we need more age diversity. And it's really important to involve more youth. And it's natural and it's normal that, of course, us who are, have a lot of experience and wisdom and accumulated fantastic scientific credentials get the seat at most of the seats at the table. Nevertheless, in the end, we are talking about the climate for our children or grandchildren, and how we can really how we can be sufficiently inclusive to their voices, how we can integrate that, their perspectives, which are clearly and undeniably different than many of ours. That's, I think, not an easy, there is no easy solution, although we are involving and have more and more efforts at involving early career scientists and young scholars, but this is still not the same as they are still perhaps a decade or perhaps 2 decades older than those who will really suffer the impacts of climate change and already have perhaps enough knowledge or opinion or sufficient climate anxiety. So I think these are really the issues that we will also, perhaps all 3 organizations will need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I'll give the floor to Silke.
So I prepared. So I prepared the slide, but yeah, okay. Yeah, so yeah, but I can start talking. So to respond to Diana, so in my experience, there is not one clear solution, but there's always some trade-off between whatever achieving scientific excellence and quality on the one side, but also being policy relevant or legitimate on the other side. And I guess different organizations have dealt differently with how to deal with all these different expectations and challenges. And I guess it's very important to look how responsive are science policy interfaces to novel challenges. So I can repeat one point that Diana has made. So when it comes to IPBES, it was made the point that there are strengths by the UN system and rules of procedures. And if you speak as a panel with one voice in the name of international science, then you produce more salient knowledge. But it was also criticized that this consensus-seeking procedure also always lead into lowest common denominator solution, and they are not able or they are not good enough to represent the full range of views. And this is the problem in particular when it comes to indigenous and local knowledge. IPBES has a task force on promoting indigenous and local knowledge, but it's also clear that ticking the box of inclusiveness or bringing stakeholders on the table is not enough to really achieve all these goals. And so I guess at some point, and this is also a problem because the bodies the mandate is policy relevant but not prescriptive. At some points, I guess we also have to address questions of agency and representation in a less instrumental but more essentialist way. And we have to also be more reflexive and do something to overcome unequal structures that limit indigenous people to participate at all levels. And when it comes to participation capacities and so on, we have to be very clear that interfaces can't fix problems which they don't cause. Problems of having access, inequalities, and having capacities to present things in scientific terms often mirror problems at the national and local level, and bodies such as IPBES or IPCC don't have capacities to jump in and provide the resources that nation states can't provide. So in other words, there is no silver bullet for this, but it's more trying to bring people in. And this is also when it comes to IPCC and IPBES, there was the critique that they have diverse inputs, but they put in diverse inputs into the same model and upscale local information with a universal model, and this contributes to preempt the substance of local knowledge. And I guess more capacity or more time has to be spent to understand fully what are local and indigenous knowledge systems, how do they work, and how and why are they different to scientific knowledge problems. And this is also a very important step to deal with local and indigenous knowledge in a more ethical and equitable way. And the same can be said about other categories such as gender or other geopolitical problems. And last but not least, I guess it also requires some broader engagement with diverse stakeholders, and this is also a topic. It's not about harvesting the outcome or something like that, but it's really it's a commitment to deal with voices that may be different, and but they can also contribute in a substantial way to make changes working on the ground. And in my experience, IPBES has done a great job, but there's also a long way to go to fully implement all the promises it has made. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. From my side, some thoughts that are a bit different about the new panel on chemicals and waste and pollution prevention. The first concern that we have currently is that something may happen that could be called paralysis by analysis, so that the panel engages in investigations and assessments, again, assessment, with data and information from different sources. It's all very diverse, fragmented, heterogeneous, and that is, of course, difficult to unify and to structure in a way that then a consistent assessment comes out of it. So there is this danger of too much analysis, which then may paralyze the process to some extent. So to be sufficiently efficient and effective at the same time, of course, the panel will have to learn how to do this. This is nothing that we can expect to be there and to be well established from the very beginning. The panel will have to learn how to do this. The second thing is the structure. I still have Diana's one slide here with the secret of the IPCC model with all the nice points that are highlighted in red. For example, strict policies on funding, strict policies on communication. All of this is not yet in place for the new panel. The first big concern is how conflict of interest will be handled, because the chemical industry is an important stakeholder, important actor in the field of chemicals, of course, globally. But of course, also the chemical industry has conflicts of interest. And that is a main challenge at this point, that a sufficiently strict and effective conflict of interest policy will be established for the new panel. And also transparency, funding, communication, all these elements that IPCC now has after 30 years, that's still missing. And there is a concern how to make sure that all of this will be established in a way that is strict and stable and robust enough. That's the second concern. And the third concern, or the third aspect, goes beyond the internal structure. It goes because the question was also about what are the limits to the outcomes of such a panel or such an interface. And here, I think what I know is, of course, from the earlier work for the POPs Review Committee, but that also applies to the other panels and even the new panel. And this is that the panels or the science policy interfaces create scientific outcome, still kind of science-based outcome, and the assessments are also science-based. But then this is taken on the policy side and treated or handled in a non-scientific way. And that makes a totally different situation, because what I experienced, for example, was I made my statement about a certain chemical in the POPs Review Committee, and then the representative of an important country said, "You are vilifying a chemical here. You are vilifying our government who has high stakes in this chemical. You can't do that." And I was totally shocked because I was not prepared for that. I was just a scientist who shared his knowledge, and I received a totally non-scientific response, which makes sense in the political realm, but how do you reconcile this? And how do you reconcile, or how do you make that transfer that the scientific outcomes still have their scientific validity also in the political field? That's, to me, a big challenge. And the answer, I don't know. I guess what we can do as scientists mostly is still to insist on the validity of the science, of the findings, and say that there is no fake news, there is no alternative facts, the science is the science. Of course, there are uncertainties, but we know them and we share them. But you can't just say it's all not valid because you don't like it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was an insider perspective that we really like for this summer school. And actually, it's also a good introduction to my last question before I open to question for the public here and the public online, is this balance between being policy relevant, which means that the assessments and the knowledge has to inform policy, but not that the assessment needs also to be not policy prescriptive. That means we cannot provide governments one way to go. So that is my last question. And I think, Diana, maybe you can start with what you think about that. How have the experts in IPCC dealt with this kind of a condition of panels of being policy relevant but not policy prescriptive? And maybe you want to react a little bit about what the other Silke and Martina said as well. So I will give you a couple of minutes for that, because I also want to hear from Silke on this question of policy relevance at IPBES, and then I will open for questions after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, first let me respond because it was really excellent points made both by Silke and Martin. So I just want to add 2 points that Silke is very right. And I think the inclusiveness is really an issue also for IPCC, and not so much for indigenous knowledge, that also, but even just with the Global South, we have been for so long trying to put a lot of emphasis on involving Global South perspectives and scientists. And even if you tick the box, as very well put in words by Silke, it still doesn't mean that they are really fully integrated. So, but I think the roots of this are very challenging to address, not only because there are major capacity issues and the IPCC alone cannot fix these major capacity shortage issues, but there are simply major issues with scientific publications and the access to major scientific publications. And even if the IPCC does provide access to these publications to the authors, to the scientists from the Global South, they don't normally have access to publish in the most influential journals, which already makes this huge divide, aggravates this divide between the Global North and Global South. And also there are very different academic and scientific cultures, and let's be honest that the IPCC has been really based on Anglo-Saxon, or at least Global North based scientific cultures, and that by nature excludes to some extent these other scientific voices on which we all need to work, which is a challenge. And finally, Martin reminded me of the COI, the conflict of interest, and that's a very good point, and we've been also struggling with it. But I think in the end, I think we are quite good at handling, but it required us to understand that there is actually no one who would not have a conflict of interest. All of us come with certain agendas, either just scientific agendas or some interests related to climate change. So instead of pretending that everybody is totally neutral and totally away and totally objective, instead of this, we are making very strong efforts that we make it transparent. Everybody's interest, different, really diverse sets of interests we make every year. Everybody has to report, fill in a very detailed conflict of interest form, and we publish these so these be made open transparently. And the other way is balancing the different interests and different stakeholders, which is of course difficult because a balance is not a scientifically objective term, especially if you talk about different perspectives and stakeholders. But nevertheless, I think that's the way how we are trying to manage this, and I think that has been working quite well. On the level on the issue of policy relevance versus policy prescriptiveness, I don't think there is really a compromise there. And maybe because I've been working too long with the IPCC, but by now I'm so much in favor of this that even in my other research, I would not really happily advocate for a single policy instrument or say that you must do this, must do that, because there are always different consequences. And we always recognize that we will never be able, as scientists, we will never be able to see all the perspectives that a decision maker has to balance, and then this is why it's always different. So I think I really embrace this concept of policy relevance, but policy prescriptiveness, or avoiding policy prescriptiveness. The only one problem is that sometimes it is being a bit misused, and governments are trying to keep away terminologies or even assessments that they don't want to see, claiming that it's policy prescriptive. For example, very interesting, the temperature goals, or just assessing which temperature levels we assess in a report is often considered policy prescriptive. But of course, since the Paris Agreement, it's already easier because we say, well, there is already an agreement which is signed by almost all of our member states. So it's not us who is prescriptive, but it's an accepted goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Silke, a couple of words. I think she has the slides on policy relevant.
Yeah, okay. I guess when it comes to IPBES, they started with having the same mandate, being policy relevant, but not prescriptive. But inside IPBES, it's quite controversial. There are some scientists calling for a neutral assessment, but there's also a coalition of scientists saying that if we assess transformative change, we have to change this mandate. And it's also contested when it comes to governments. On the one side, countries from Latin America, they are calling for IPBES becoming more political, addressing question of justice, power, and all the more contested questions. And there's an interesting coalition of countries, for instance, China and the US. They say we have to focus on assessment and stay with the non-prescriptive notion. In other words, there is no consensus about this. What seems to be important is that IPBES and IPCC are changing. It seems that they gradually move from global environmental assessments, meaning attributing causes of environmental problems, detecting impacts, and assessing response options. This is global environmental assessment, but they seem to move to a more solution or outcome-oriented mode of doing assessments. And this also leads to novel challenges. And it seems as if they have to make their hands dirty. They have to engage directly with diverse experiences, user needs and values, politics. And so the question is their institutional setting fit for function? Do they have capacities to deal with the novel challenges? And both IPBES and IPCC, they are addressing the topic of transformation. And this is because on the one side, and this is an assessment of the IPCC, there's sound scientific evidence that the world needs to transform in a number of complex and connected ways, unprecedented in terms of scale. This is what the IPCC has said. And IPBES has an assessment on transformative change now. And the question then, and it's also contested, was, does transformative change mean? There's an least common denominator consensus that change is big, complex, and it will take time. But it's also associated with paradigm shifts, meaning that incremental change will be not enough to reach the climate targets, but also the sustainability goals. In other words, what is needed is radical change, paradigm shifts, innovation, and alternative, and last but not least, societal transformation. And this also means that former modes of changing, such as incremental or reformist change, may not be enough to keep the goals. This also means that we don't only have to change or adapt procedures, but also challenges goals. So this is a more fundamental way of changing. And so the question is the turn towards solution-oriented assessments or towards assessing transformative change in order to achieve sustainability goals? Is this also a moment to rethink science policy interfaces. On the one side, we see the transformative power of science, and then we can also say this leads to new responsibility for science. What can science contribute to reach these targets? But also is a new social contract needed between expert states and stakeholders. And this also leads to the question whether and how science policy interfaces have also to openly address key elements of transformative change, which are highly political, such as human drivers, such as land use, power inequalities, and so on. And also, and the IPCC was quite reluctant to address questions of justice and equity for some times. It's doing now, but in the beginning, I guess there was a reluctance to go into these contested questions. And last but not least, it also means that we have to think about or take it serious. What does it mean if there are plural knowledge systems and plural ways how to do transformative change? And this also implies that we have to think about how can science policy interfaces be responsive and adaptive to forms of non-linear change and account for the contingency and the unpredictability of these forms of change. And last but not least, it also would include to reflect our own role. Are science and technology really solving problems of environmental change, or are they also contributing to create these problems? And last but not least, what are ways of thinking, such as when it comes to climate change, we often think if the carbon price is high enough, then there will be a technical innovation. And we can also start challenging the idea of infinite growth and other underlying assumptions. And in other words, this also would include to reflect our own role and ways how we contribute to emerging environmental problems and to catalyze transformative change.
Thank you, Silke. That is really useful, and I think it's a lot for us to reflect, especially that last slide. Yeah, I will give you literally 1 minute,
Yeah.
30 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's okay that all three can speak.
Yeah, totally.
I would like to make a remark in response to Diana about the conflict of interest, which is very important, I think, because in one respect, I don't agree. It's very important to differentiate between all the personal biases and interests that we all have as a person. So we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. That applies to everyone. But that's different from what I would call an industry conflict of interest, which was phrased nicely by Upton Sinclair in 1935 by saying, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. That's not the same as having a personal interest in a subject. There's a very useful paper by Lisa Barrow and our co-author, Grundy is his last name, which has the title, Why Having an Interest is Not a Conflict of Interests. I think that's an important lesson. So it's not correct, I would say, to say that we all have conflicts of interests. We have our biases, but even in the IPCC document on COI, it says a bias is not a conflict of interest. Very important differentiation to make and to keep in mind.
Thank you, Martin. Unfortunately, Diana, I won't let you respond to that, even though I know you want to. Maybe after, if you can stay a bit, because Martin will stay with us. If you can stay a bit more with us after, we can have a bit of a discussion on that. But I wanted to open the floor for some questions because time is running. We have also other things after this one. So I will first take some questions from the participants of the summer school. So 1, 2. Okay, so I will start with Gautam. You need to use the microphone.
Okay. Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. So the first one was we had the small discussion on the idea of making it more inclusive, or the systematic issues within IPCC to make it more inclusive and include the global south. And even though there's a discussion on it, what do you think could be the structural revolution that could take place that could make it more of an inclusive system? And also, I'm pardon my ignorance on the mandate of IPCC, but is it possible for IPCC to maybe collaborate with some other UN bodies to make sure that this inclusivity comes into formation? And another question I have is that in regards with the summary for policymakers for IPCC, just from an insider perspective, I think Diana could probably respond to that, about from the first draft of the summary of policymakers to the final draft, how much do you think it actually waters down?
That's a very, very good question. Diana, I will give you time to respond to that, but I'll take the question of Shaw as well first, and then I'll give the floor to Diana.
Sure. Thank you very much for such interesting presentation discussion. So I'm keen to learn your view on how actually these three panels should, collaborate or integrate views. I think we can agree on those three triple crises as not independent, rather interacting, interdependent, or sometimes there are trade-offs. For instance, if you push, for instance, decarbonization of energy sector and then putting renewable utility scale renewable energy, solar panels and the winds, that can impact on the biodiversities and open space of the country. Over exploitation of rare metals, which is necessary for green transformation, can, impact on the pollution of the locals. So I think there's to some extent, there are some trade-offs possibly. So how can those three panels collaborate and then to communicate integrated and holistic messages, and then also avoiding the misuse of science?
Thank you so much. That is a very good question. And I see there is also online a question of Janos Pastor, which is similar, how to address interlinkage between the different problems. So I will give now the floor to Diana to respond to the first question. And maybe for the second one, I will give 1 minute for each speaker to kind of address the question of interlinkage between the free platform. Maybe starting with Martin, because he has the opportunity to create a new platform that maybe have some opportunities to create things that don't exist yet. So Diana, would you like to respond to the question about the IPCC? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And these are indeed excellent questions. And we do have on our agenda that in the next cycle, we do want to have a very much stronger collaboration between the different UN bodies. We have already started this stronger collaboration with IPBES. We had a joint workshop. We have a report together, but still clearly much more needs to be done. But again, there is always a fine line between where you focus your attention. And in the end, everybody in IPCC is doing its work on a voluntary basis. So really where the more integration you do, in the end, you have less time for the focus work. So which I'm not saying we shouldn't do, but that has been always the question, for example, cross-working group cooperation and so on. But absolutely, we have that on the agenda, and fortunately, the other UN bodies are also very open to cooperation. But I wouldn't say, I'd never said that IPCC is not inclusive enough. What I said that the issues, while our inclusivity has constraints, is rooted in general problems. For example, the academic cultures, science publication cultures, academic discourse cultures, and so on, and capacity issues, so which are beyond, which we alone as an organization cannot address. Perhaps together, actually, maybe that would be one of the good purposes of cooperation between these bodies, to try to more structured way address these major injustices, for example, in publications and access to academic literature related issues, which seem to be really just being aggravated in the last couple of years. With regard to SPM, I really don't think that we could say they are watered down. They are becoming different, that's for sure. But actually, I think they're really becoming much more precise, because we have amazing governments and amazing experts in each government, and they do pick up a lot of really minor but really important issues. So in the end, I think they get stronger. It's true that, again, it's a consensus. An SPM is a consensus, but it doesn't mean that those perhaps extreme views, extreme positions are not in our reports. So someone who wants to go to the extremes can go to our reports. But I'm a strong advocate for, after having experienced at least a dozen approvals, that actually the SPMs get much stronger as a result of our approval processes. With regard to the triple crisis, yes, I fully agree, and I think we. The problem is it's not only us cooperating, but I think what we need to catalyze is the science cooperating more, because, for example, on our scenarios, that's where I think it starts, that we have that influences a lot of our SPMs and our solution space, but there I see not yet sufficient integration between these different fields of science. Finally, I do want to get back to the point of bias versus interest. I agree with you, Martin, on one point, on your point, and certainly we also take this differentiation bias versus interest. But in the end of the day, if you're honest, we cannot say that we don't have financial interest in the end. In the end, before the Paris Agreement, none of us really dared saying that really we should go to 1.5 degrees, because we wouldn't have gotten funding. We also depend very much on our governments or what funding we receive. So I think in the end, there is no one. Is until, you know, maybe Greta Thunberg or the youth who don't yet have any financial who don't yet depend on any funding, or even nobody's paying their paycheck, they are perhaps still independent. But beyond that, I think none of us, and it is very difficult how to manage balance these. But I think it's a fascinating discussion, and thank you really for bringing that up and for adding these really important points to this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Diana. And Martin, please do not respond to that. To the last one, but I would like to hear from you, though, and you can add after about that one. I would like to hear from you about this question of about the interlinkage, and what can we do better to link with other, like environmental crises from your perspective. And also maybe Silke, you can add just a tiny bit more from what Diana said on the work that is already done. Thank you.
Yes, I first would like to agree with Diana on something she just said, because I think for the question of integration, it's the science that first has to be more closely integrated. And the IPCC just published actually two papers on with a call for closer integration of biodiversity research and chemical pollution research, because chemical pollution research has not really been adopted by biodiversity research. These two areas have been different and separate for decades. And the contribution of chemical pollution to biodiversity loss is not fully reflected in what biodiversity research does. And that is a call that we have made, and that's a call that addresses the scientific activity and the scientific level of integration. And only then, I think, the science-policy interface and the policy processes can build on that new science that we need here. In general, it is difficult because we all create our knowledge in our silos to some extent. That is also a necessity to some extent, because we can't handle the entire world and everything in what we can do with our limited minds. And that's why we have disciplines. And I think often it is said the world has problems, university has disciplines, but that is still a necessity. We have to organize our knowledge around certain cores of methods and data that we create for a certain area. And we cannot fully overcome it. I think that is not possible. We need to talk, we need to listen, we need to build interfaces between the interfaces, and we need to establish all that. But this is, of course, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes capacity. So it adds complexity and also may make things even slower than they are already. So I would say there's a bit of a caveat here. Of course, we want to call for integration of the different areas, but we also have to see what kind of cost it would have, and that it should not stifle our activity in a certain area.
Thank you, Martin. What about you, Silke?
I guess it's already the most relevant things are said. Just an anecdote. I guess there was this conference, Planet Under Pressure, some years ago in London, and then at this time, I guess it was Bob Watson. He suggested we should have a super panel, including IPBES, IPCC, to have one advisory body. But there was a lot of resistance from IPCC and IPBES, because I guess it's also important to deepen in silos to create robust scientific assessments on causal frameworks and so on. And so I would say it doesn't make sense to have a super panel including everything, but you have to find a nested network and a good structure how different bodies can interact and cooperate, so that you have bodies integrating things and saying that there are linkages, trade-offs and things like that. And I guess the frameworks are already there. We have the United Nations, we have UNEA, the Assembly, and we have the Sustainable Developing Goals. And the IPCC is already using the Sustainable Developing Goals in order to assess in the linkages. And it's also important to have a coherent system, I guess. If everybody, every panel is coming up with U values and U trade-offs, then it gets a big mess, and you have an overriding framework where different assessment bodies or panels can contribute to.
Thank you very much, Silke. I'm just going to take 2 questions online, and then we'll come back to the room, to the people that are here as well. So one question maybe for you, Diana, is from Leslie Onion. Which is, there are many of them here, but I'll take the most important one, is what was the mechanism for the joint establishment of the panel by WMO and UNEP? What sort of mechanism underpinned that collaboration? And then the other question is also this one. Yeah, if the authors of the report are remunerated, I have the answer to that. And who nominate and select the authors? I'll let you respond the first one, which I think is important, the mechanism to establish the panel. How did it work? Thank you. You're mute, you're mute.
Apologies, we always make this mistake. So anyway, these are really excellent questions, and yes, I think it's very interesting that that the IPCC kind of comes from the marriage of the WHO and the UNEP. I'm afraid I wasn't there then, and we don't talk about a lot about the about that phase, but now we see a great benefit of having kind of 2 parent bodies. So I do recommend this structure to other organizations who might be considering this. With regard to authors' remuneration, so you said that yes, we are not, none of the authors are remunerated. In fact, it's the institutions who kind of donate the time of their scientists, and this is really important. Some governments do pay or provide more capacity, some research support, which then again results in a bit of imbalances, because sometimes some rich countries, authors get a bit more resourced, and that's where they can have more influence in the report than Global South also. So again, this is a bit, but these are really minor issues altogether. It's really important that there is no remuneration. And selection is governments nominate. Also, international bodies can nominate, and it's the bureau who selects. And the selection process is a very complex process where inclusiveness and diversity and balance by region, by gender, by discipline is very carefully. It's a big puzzle game, so that we really try to make craft these careful balances exactly, for example, to manage the different interests or different biases. Very good point. And so in the end, it's always imperfect, but I think we are really improving also in really more and more balanced set of authors. But for that, it's really important to have sufficient capacity in all the countries. So with that, I think the one of the key, if there is one takeaway, what is a really successful global science policy interface, for that we need really successful global capacity building in the underrepresented communities.
Thank you, Diana. And for IPBES, the process is also about the same. So I'll take 2 last questions for the room because time is running, and I would like to have some concluding words from the speakers. So one here and then one there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Otto Simonet, the director of Soil Environment Network here in Geneva. Thank you for this interesting panel. While we're getting to the end, one question is about time. Because in climate change, we lost 30 years. I think we knew everything already in the 80s. Now, are these panels accelerators? Are they slowing down everything, or are you time neutral?
I'll take the other question first, and then so Diana can think a bit more about the answer.
Thank you. My question is about how we can leverage new technologies such as like generative AI and things like that to improve the performance of these global panels. I'm thinking particularly about like streamlining communication between different channels or tailoring messages to specific stakeholders that operate at different scales. And I wonder if that's one way of like accelerating the assessment phase so that panels can then move onto the next phase and go beyond that phase in a much shorter time period.
That is an excellent question, and we had a session before this one when David Jensen were talking to us about the role of AI, and yeah, the answer was really interesting. But I'll let the speakers to answer that. So maybe Diana about the time, the time constraint, and maybe also if you have some thoughts about this AI, just 30 seconds, and then I can wrap up slowly towards the end.
Thank you. I absolutely agree on AI and IT. I'm actually standing for election for vice chair of IPCC, and if I do get elected, that will be one of my most important tasks, I think, or one of my most important missions, because this is a completely new direction, and we really need to embrace these very new directions of which is happening in digitalization, information technology, and AI. So we have to go with the flow, and we cannot just and we have to take more advantage of them. With regard to acceleration, I do believe that the IPCC has definitely catalyzed the acceleration, but as a big intergovernmental consensus-based body, it's not the one who will we cannot take, what is important to say, that one body cannot do everything for the climate. We take a really important role of the global consensus building and assessing the science and making that, building that scientific basis for decision making. And that, I think, does catalyze acceleration. And in fact, what you do see is that, for example, our 1.5 degree report was unprecedentedly accelerated history. Just 3 years after that report was published, and when before that no net zero was mentioned, 3 years after that, 90% of all global emissions have been mandated to be net zero, to meet net zero targets towards the middle of the century. I do believe that's a major acceleration. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Do you, Martin, Silke, do you have some thoughts about this AI? How could the AI contribute to accelerating the assessment, the production, and the deliverable?
I think I'm more skeptical. I think it's still human intelligence that's the bottleneck. And you can't accelerate human thinking by AI methods. And it's still humans who have to finally integrate the knowledge, understand the data, and come to the conclusions. That's a complicated judgment. And for that, you need experience and a worldview that only humans have. So for data treatment and efficiency and all of that, of course, yes, but not for the actual processing all of this and final outcomes.
Okay.
I guess the IPCC already they use machine learning in order to do the reviews and so on. There are possibilities where you can use IA, and Ottmar Etenhofer is promoting to have policy evaluation by machine learning, but I wouldn't take AI as the silver bullet to everything, because I'm working at a technical university who promotes AI all the time. But you can also inscribe biases in terms of gender into models, and there is also responsibility which has to be taken by humans who make sense of information provided by computer models and so on. And I guess there was also critique to the IPCC with the integrated assessment models, where the point was always the model says, the model does, but the model doesn't take over responsibility. And I guess we have also to be very critical and aware what kind of assumptions are inscribed in models. And the same problem is accelerated when it comes to artificial intelligence. And I guess it's a mixed methods thing. We can use these technologies where we see they have an added value, but we have to do it in a responsible way.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting insight, and it's good to enter this question of technology. So unfortunately, we have to close this event now because we have something else after. So I would like to give 1 minute each of our speaker for some concluding thoughts, either on the future of this panel, but especially I would like you to have some thoughts on how can early career researchers and policy actors and analysts can be involved in this panels. Diana already mentioned it. There is a need for regenerating the age of people that are involved in assessment. And I think it would be nice for our participants, especially from the summer school, to hear how they can be involved in those and what are the mechanisms that those panels could offer, or what else advice you could offer. Thank you. I will start with maybe Silke, and then Martin, and then we'll finish with Diana. Thank you.
So I guess IPBES already has an IPBES fellowship program where you can apply. And so if we share the slides, there's a link of this fellow program. And in addition, you can start an internship at the secretaries, but also the technical support unions. And in the case of IPBES, there was a guy who did his PhD on the not IPBES, but the former assessment. His name is Thomas Kötsch. He was working for the IPBES secretary for a while. And so his work on science policy interfaces also opened the door to shape such an institution. You can also support to coordinating lead authors, as in some countries such as Germany, ministries are funding assistant and scientific support positions. You can do research on relevant topics, and you have to publish it in leading journals. And last but not least, when it comes to IPBES, there are many venues for stakeholder involvement, such as stakeholder workshops. There are before the plenaries and so on, and they are pretty open to non-scientific actors. And it's like a ferry, and where you see what other people do, and it's also fun, and it's pretty clear how interesting and how diverse the whole field is.
Thanks, Silke. Martin?
Yeah, thank you. Could you please put up the slide in my presentation? Yeah, thank you. Because there is a paper that addresses this question directly, and the last of the three authors, Jianwen Wang, will be here, I think, on Thursday. And you can certainly ask him about more details about the paper. So I just wanted to highlight that the paper exists, where he has summarized, or they have summarized several aspects of what is useful as to keep in mind if you want to somehow join this process. Well, I can say, from my own experience, of course, it takes a lot of time and extra effort. So if you are still a scientist and want to make a career or build a career as a scientist, you would have to make an extra effort that adds to your scientific work. And that is often also a bit difficult and challenging and just demanding. And it requires, because it's different from the scientific work, it requires that you understand how the policy world works. And often it works in a very, very different way from how science works. And often the scientists want to be scientists because they don't like the way how policy works. So that is a challenge that we all may have. For example, one question is you have to really understand what policymakers want, what they need. And they may just not be interested in the science that you want to do because it's not relevant to them. So do you want to change the subject of your science then, or what do you do? So there are trade-offs and important questions here for yourself to ask. It's not just something you could do in addition or as a second track. It really requires decisions. Thank you.
And it also requires a change of academic career structures and so on, that science policy interactions are more included in career patterns.
Yeah, but that's of course not what they can do themselves. That's something that
the
academic system has to do. Yeah.
Also to change at some point. Yeah.
Big structure. Diana, I give you the last word on this subject.
Thank you. I actually, in IPCC, I see this a bit differently because there are many early career scientists who have made really amazing career progresses by volunteering. So I would want to encourage everyone who's really interested. You can volunteer, as said very well by Silke, but not necessarily only as with CLAs, but also with bureau members, also with a different just authors themselves. And I see that sometimes really enthusiastic, committed, and well-working and diligent, either just chapter scientists or such helpers have made it all the way up to synthesis report, summary for policymaker authors. So I do see a lot of opportunities, and also in the end, you may be involved in a lot of publications with this network. So I do think it's an outstanding opportunity for really motivated and enthusiastic early career scientists who are able to devote the time for this. But also, I think another form is becoming an observer, not as a person, but I think more youth organizations, especially youth academic organizations, would be great to become observers, for example, to the IPCC. And if you yourselves can come up with ideas how our platforms, how our panels can even better integrate the perspectives of the youth and also young scientific voices, I'm personally very open to these ideas. And to conclude, I just want to come back to a question about whether our SPMs are watered down, and come back to also Silke's point. Often when we think something is getting watered down and all those frustrating policymakers or others just are not putting our great science into that, often actually I've understood during the decades it's some injustice behind that we don't see because we have a biased perspective. So I think this is why it's really great to be included in such processes, because you are really enriching your academic scientific perspectives.
Thank you very much, Diana. We have to conclude this event. I'd like to thank our speakers. That was an amazing debate, I think. I think it's the first time I've heard different panels debate about this topic, and also the new panel. So thank you very much, Diana. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Silke. I would like also to thank the Geneva Environment Network for hosting the summer school and hosting this event. Thank you for all the participants, and thank you to the participant online as well. I apologize we couldn't cover all of your questions, but I'm sure you know all of them, so you can reach out to them if you have more questions. You can also reach out to us, and we'll give you their contact if there is a really pressing question you would like to ask them. So thank you, everybody. And for the participant of the summer school, our journey continue in a bit. Thank you.